Russian history is iconic, whether it's the rise of Stalin, the doom of the Romanovs, or the tyranny of Ivan the Terrible. Despite this, the earliest origins of this massive nation are often neglected. In this series, we'll go back to a time before the Soviets and Tsars, a time of mighty Viking princes, hardy Slavic tribesmen, and nomadic hordes from the steppe. Ancient Rus merchants had access to a vast network of goods, but even the wealthiest among them didn't have a way to get tasty Japanese snacks. The sponsor of our video, Boxu, can give you exactly that opportunity. Boxu partners up with authentic Japanese snack makers who've been in business for over 100 years, creating a unique product that we can recommend 100%. Trust us, we've been absolutely demolishing the snacks kindly sent by Boxu. Every snack has been specifically crafted by traditional snack makers, and every box is more than the sum of its parts. We've been sharing the snacks with our friends and family, and genuinely think that Boxu is a great gift for your loved ones. You can get new snacks every month. Salty, spicy, sweet, fruity, every taste and mood are covered. This month's box is called Seasons of Japan and is all about celebrating the beauty of each season. We can definitely recommend you try white strawberry and Paku Paku Thai chocolate. Both are full of sweet goodness. Get Boxu for yourself and your loved ones and you won't be disappointed. Boxu has a special offer for our viewers. Use our code KingsandGenerals10 and the link in the description to get 10% off and save up to $47 off your own authentic Japanese subscription box from Boxu. Don't miss out on this amazing snack journey through Japan. For millennia, the grassy plains of the Ukraine and southern Russia, the Ponto-Caspian steppe, had been inhabited by a diverse caste of hardy nomadic people thriving along the Don, Dnieper and Volga rivers. The first written accounts of this land date back to classical antiquity in the 7th century BC. During this time, the steppe was dominated by various tribes of Iranian origin, the most prominent being the Scythians and Sarmatians. The ancient Greeks, who had a smattering of cities along the shore of the Black Sea, recorded stories about the nomads who lived to the north. Herodotus relates a tale that claims the Scythians were born of a union of the demigod Hercules and a serpent woman. Meanwhile, the Sarmatians were known for the legendary strength of their women, and therefore were considered a product of mixing between the Scythians and mythical Amazonian warriors. More historically reliable accounts describe these Iranic pastoralists as a sturdy people who lived and died on the backs of their steeds, subsisting on horse milk and meat while enjoying the pleasures of psychoactive herbs and undiluted wines. For centuries, their domination of the steppe would be near unchallenged, but further to the north, a young and ambitious tribe was finding its bearings. These, of course, were the Slavs. The true origins of the Slavs are shrouded in mystery. The earliest written accounts of their existence come from Roman sources. In the 1st century AD, the senator and historian Tacitus described a tribe he called the Venedi, a people who lived primarily along the Vistula River. Tacitus noted that they built homes, carried shields, and fought unmounted, distinguishing them from their nomadic Sarmatian neighbours. Dismissed as yet another barbarian people by the classical civilizations, the Venedi were most likely the progenitors of all of today's Slavic nations. For centuries, these Proto-Slavs were hemmed in by their powerful Celtic and Germanic neighbours to the west, and Scytho-Sarmatians to the south. This changed between the 4th and 6th centuries as a great migration took place, with the Huns and various Germanic peoples migrating into the borders of the collapsing Western Roman Empire. Broadly speaking, this enormous migration allowed the early Slavs to expand beyond their original homeland in all directions. By then, the Venedi had diffused into numerous distinct branching tribes. Some tribes crossed the Danube into Eastern Roman territory, seizing lands for themselves in the Balkans and becoming the forebears of the South Slavs. Some tribes ventured westward into the domain of the Avars. There they carved a home for themselves and became the eventual predecessors of the Western Slavs. Most important to our story are the tribes who went eastwards into modern Ukraine. The Scythians and Sarmatians, who for centuries had dominated the steppe, were weakened by centuries of war with the Goths, Romans and Huns. The Proto-Slavs sunk their roots into this unstable region, eventually assimilating the last remnants of these ancient peoples. While we know little of this eastern migration, it is evident that in the following decades, Slavic peoples would continue to expand across much of modern Ukraine, Belarus, and central western Russia, intermixing with various clans of indigenous Finno-Ugrics and Baltic peoples, the ancestral cousins of Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, and Finns. By 750 AD, the Eastern Slavs occupied land from Lake Ladoga in the north to the coast of the Black Sea. While they shared a common language and culture, the Eastern Slavs were not politically united, divided into many tribes that operated on complex kinship ties. They tended to avoid the high ground, settling along rivers and lakes where water was abundant. There they built strongholds with enclosed earth and timber ramparts, wooden walls, and an external ditch. These bastions were often surrounded by various peripheral villages, which provided grain and livestock. Not much is known about the native religion of the early Slavs, other than that they held to a pantheon of gods resembling those of their Indo-European cousins. The most well attested to of these is Perun, their god supreme, wielder of thunder and lord of the sky. His eternal foe was Veles, ruler of the underworld, associated with magic, shamanism, and sorcery. There were of course many other deities, embodying fertility, fire, and the passing seasons, among other things. Pagan Slavs saw their gods as being tied intrinsically with the untamed wilderness in which they lived, and built their shrines in oaken groves. It should be noted that early Slavic society is reconstructed primarily through later Christian writers who looked upon their pagan forebears with disdain. Nevertheless, some information can be passed from the sources available to us. For example, the law of hospitality was the most sacred of rites to tribal Slavs. All guests were cherished without exception, and any tribe who mistreated an itinerant traveller would be attacked by neighbouring tribes for their dishonour. War was not uncommon, both with the Balts and Finns and amongst the Slavs. They avoided pitched battles, instead fighting in dense woodlands with ample cover, while using short iron spears, heavy wooden shields, and bows nocked with poison-tipped arrows. The lives of the early Eastern Slavs were decentralized and chaotic, yet there was order and harmony through their shared customs. Nonetheless, things were soon to change, as new arrivals came from the north on the decks of dragon-headed longboats. At the turn of the 9th century, the Scandinavian peninsula had a burgeoning population. In a cold, mountainous climate, good farmland was a rarity. This pushed the Norsemen to sail from their homes seeking new lands. Generally speaking, the Danes went westwards, where they became known to the English and French as Vikings. The Swedes, however, ventured to the east, where they quickly discovered the mighty rivers spanning down the continental mainland. By sailing down the crucial waterways of Eastern Europe, the Norsemen became deeply engaged in the trade networks that had existed in the region for centuries. At the confluence of the Kama and Volga, they encountered the Bulgars, with whom they traded furs, wax, and honey in exchange for silver. Occasionally they rode further upriver and traded with the Khazars, whose control over the steppe had granted them rule over an incredibly wealthy land of diverse peoples, including many Slavic tribes. Meanwhile, those who sailed up the Dnieper soon found themselves in the Black Sea, and before long, the Eastern Roman capital of Constantinople. They called this splendorous place Miklagard, literally meaning the Great City. In early June of 860, the Byzantine Emperor Michael III moved out with his army from Constantinople towards the front line with the Abbasid Caliphate. The mighty Byzantine fleet also followed, and the capital was left almost defenseless, with only a small garrison remaining in Constantinople, as the Byzantine leadership did not expect any attack. Chronicles describing the following events generally agree that the Rus fleet, under the leadership of Varangian warlords Askold and Dir, entered the Bosphorus on the 18th of June 860. Modern historians argue that the Rus knew how defenseless Constantinople was, as they already had developed relations with the Arab Caliphate, and as the time frame and distance since the day of the departure of the Emperor Michael III from the capital was sufficient for Arab intelligence to inform the Rus. The Greek sources mention 200 Rus ships, while the Venetian John the Deacon claims 360 ships. The sources do not state the exact number of land troops the Rus had, but since the average Viking ships of the era had capacity between 30 and 80 men comfortably on board, depending on size, the conservative estimate of 40 men per ship leads to an estimate of 8,000 men. Askold and Deer's men met no resistance as they landed on the shore and started pillaging the unprotected suburbs of Constantinople. Many were killed and taken as hostages. Then the Rus fleet moved to the Marmara Sea and attacked the Prince's Islands. Again the residents were slaughtered, monasteries, palaces and other places carrying riches were plundered. The residents inside the walls were in fear as they had nobody to defend them. There is no definitive conclusion regarding whether the Rus attempted to take the city walls and capture Constantinople. As the Byzantines lacked forces to offer any effective resistance, the Patriarch Photius called the city dwellers to pray to Holy Mary, the protector of the city, and ordered them to hang her banner on the city walls. On the 4th of August 860, the Rus ended the siege, boarded their ships, and left the area with major spoils. The latter part of the description of the Rus attack on Constantinople has another version glorifying the emperor and a divine intervention which saved the city from the barbarians. According to this version, Michael III quickly returned to the city after receiving information on the Rus attack and joined Patriarch Photius in prayers, and after the hanging of the Holy Mary banner, a storm which scattered the Rus fleet took place, eventually leading to the withdrawal of Askold and Deer in panic. Photius does not mention anything regarding Michael's arrival and a miracle saving in his writings, as these details were added later by the Chronicle of Simeon Logophet. The Romans were made to accept the Varangians as partners in commerce, making them wealthy with silks and wine. War and trade helped the Norsemen prosper, and that wealth meant they were there to stay. Of course, plying down the great rivers meant that the Norsemen inevitably passed through the Slavic territory. The Slavs called them Varangians or Rus, terms likely derived from the Old Norse words meaning pledged companions and the people who row. Initial interactions between them were hostile, as the Norsemen often raided Slavic villages, exacting tribute and taking slaves to trade in the southern markets. Within a few decades, the Scandinavians dominated not only the Slavs, but Finns and Balts as well. It would be this intersection of cultures that would give rise to the first united ruling dynasty in Russian history, the Rurikids. Before we explain the rise of the Rurikids, we should note that much of early Russian history is known through the Primary Chronicle, written in the year 1113 AD by a monk, Nestor. While his works are considered the most valuable source of knowledge on this era, the legitimacy of his work is often called into question by modern historians. Still, the Primary Chronicle presents the only complete story moving forward, and its tale will be the one presented by us. According to Nestor, the Slavs, Finns and Balts revolted against their Scandinavian masters at some point before 860 AD, driving them back across the Northern Sea. Evidently, the Norsemen had been something of a stabilizing force in the region, for once they had been expelled, the Slavic tribes quickly devolved back into habitual warfare with themselves and their neighbours. The Chronicle had this to say: "There was no law among them, but tribe rose against tribe. Discord thus ensued among them, and they began to war against one another. They said to themselves, 'Let us seek a prince who may rule over us and judge us according to the law.' They went overseas to the Varangian Russes, and said to the people of Rus, 'Our whole land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to reign and rule over us.' The prince invited by the Slavs was named Rurik. Promptly accepting their offer, he settled amongst his new people in 862. Rurik established his capital on the Volkhov River, likely on the site of an older Slavic stronghold. His city soon grew to become a prosperous hub of riverbound trade, and became known to the Slavs as Novgorod. For 17 years, Prince Rurik worked to stabilize his realm, establishing laws and formal tributary rulership over the many native tribes of the region. He died in 879, leaving his realm to his kinsman Oleg. By all accounts, Oleg was the classic embodiment of a Viking warrior, an ambitious prince who sought to expand his lands through conquest. To that end, he turned his gaze upon the Great Khaganate to the south. Ruling the crossroads of an international trading hub, the Khazars were naturally tolerant of the many tribes and religions in their domain. In one of history's more peculiar twists, the Turkic rulers had even converted to Judaism. Among their tributary subjects were the majority of the Eastern Slavic tribes in the south. For centuries, the Khazars prospered in their steppe land. Oleg, however, was not a foe to be trifled with. He had all the tribes of the north united under him, and commanded a vast army comprised of Norse, Finnic and Slavic warriors. According to Nestor, Oleg sailed his army up the Dnieper River in 882, seizing the towns of Smolensk and Lubeck en route. Before long, they arrived upon the wooded hills of Kiev, an ancient outpost most likely founded by Eastern Slavic migrants as early as the 5th century. By the time of Oleg's arrival, Kiev was a vassal of the Khazars and was ruled by the Norse warlords Askold and Dir, who evidently were the ones behind the Varangian attack on Byzantium back in 860. Oleg is said to have confronted his fellow Norse rulers, decrying them boldly, saying, "You are not princes, nor even of princely stock, but I am of princely birth." Askold and Dir were promptly slain, and Oleg took firm control of Kiev. He was quick to see the value of this town. Kiev was surrounded by fertile soil, and its position along the Dnieper River gave it the potential to be a heart of trade and commerce. Oleg declared himself the Prince of Kiev, and decided it would be from there he would rule the rest of the realm. Soon he ventured on, wresting more Slavic tribes from Khazar control. By 885, the prince had united the vast majority of the Eastern Slavs under his rule. It is here that the Kievan Rus was born, a nation that would survive for 3 centuries and grow to become among the most prosperous in medieval Europe. Kiev was its grand capital, from which the descendants of Rurik and Oleg ruled as princes of the Rurikid dynasty. While Rus originally referred to the nation's ruling Scandinavian elite, in time, all the tribes of the Kievan realm, whether Slavic or Nordic, simply came to be known as the people of the Rus. Through fate and conquest, the Rurikid princes had given their names to the land, which Russia, the land of the Rus, retains to this day. The early Kievan Rus was in function a tributary empire, comprised of internally autonomous tribes and towns, all under the suzerainty of the Grand Prince of the Rurikid dynasty, who was based in the prosperous trading city of Kiev. Each tribe within was ruled independently, paying a tribute to Kiev, and joined their armies to the Grand Prince in times of war. The tribes received protection from the Grand Prince's Druzhina, an elite retinue of warriors who kept order across the realm. Culturally, the early Kievan state was an ethnic and linguistic smorgasbord. The Rurikid princes and their Druzhina were most likely predominantly Scandinavian, although a skilled warrior from any origin could join the prince's retinue. The majority of peoples in Rus lands were the Eastern Slavs, who spoke the Old East Slavic language, from which modern Russian, Ukrainian and Belarusian stem. Other peoples in the Kievan Rus included the Finno-Ugric and Baltic-speaking tribes in the north, and likely some Turkic peoples from former Khazaria. Religion across the realm was a diverse spectrum. The pagan Slavs continued to worship Perun and Volos in their oaken groves, while the Scandinavian elites retained aspects of their own pantheons of Thor, Odin and Loki. One of the most famous living accounts of Norse religious rites comes from the Arab traveller Ibn Fadlan, whose journey up the Volga River in 922 brought him into an encounter with a boisterous tribe of Varangian Norsemen. Fadlan watched in fascination and horror as the body of a great Viking chieftain was laid in his longship alongside a slave girl, who had volunteered to be ritually sacrificed. The boat and all the precious personal belongings it carried were thus set alight in a great bonfire, and the souls within committed to Valhalla. This funerary practice was probably unique to the Kievan Vikings and deviated from the Scandinavian rites. However, it is a testament that some form of Norse paganism thrived among the warrior caste of the Kievan realm. The Rurikid princes remained fiercely warlike throughout most of their early history, seeking to become rich through plunder and tribute. To them, the ultimate prize would always be the most splendorous land on the far end of the Black Sea. To that end, they turned the dragonhead prows of their longboats towards Constantinople, the place they simply called the Great City, Miklagard. Norse raiders had failed to take Constantinople in 860, but now they were unified under the Rurikids, they could muster a larger and more organized invasion force. The second Rus attack on Constantinople also has dubious details, since the Byzantine sources do not directly mention anything regarding the event, and all descriptions of the attack are in early Russian sources, including the Russian Primary Chronicle. According to the Laurentian and Hypatian redactions of the Chronicle, in 907, the Varangian prince Oleg of Novgorod, who had been able to put several Slavic, Turkic, Finnish-Ugric peoples including the Chuds, Polyanians, Croats, Merians, and Teversians under his control, moved towards Constantinople. Oleg's army consisted of 2,000 ships, each containing 40 men, which sailed from the Dnieper into the Black Sea, and an unknown number of horsemen who travelled on horseback from the Rus territories towards Constantinople. Thus, according to the Russian Primary Chronicle, Oleg had 80,000 men in his army, excluding the cavalry. This is a truly astonishingly high number for its era, especially for the Rus, who were just consolidating at the time as a state and regional force. The Novgorod Chronicle mentions 100 to 200 ships, which would make the army size 4,000 to 8,000 men, a much more plausible figure. Then the Russian Primary Chronicle describes Oleg's army reaching Constantinople. The Byzantines locked the Golden Horn Strait with a chain, preventing the Rus fleet from passing into the Marmara Sea. Instead, Oleg and his men disembarked on the shore and proceeded to loot and pillage the suburbs of the city, murdering and capturing Byzantine subjects in the process without any resistance from the imperial forces. The reason for lack of resistance is not described, and it is peculiar that one of the strongest naval forces of the time, the Byzantine fleet, did not oppose Oleg's ships. After looting and pillaging, Oleg commanded his men to make wheels, which they attached to the ships and ordered them to be moved against the city. The Byzantines became worried and asked Oleg to cease hostilities and offered tribute in exchange. Oleg accepted and his troops stopped. During the negotiations, the Byzantines offered Oleg wine, but the latter refused to drink, fearing poison. This certainly flared tempers, and eventually the Byzantines accepted Oleg's demand to pay 12 gold pieces for every Rus soldier as an annual tribute. Oleg's attack was concluded by a treaty between the Rus and the Byzantines, which is reflected in the Byzantine sources. With that, Oleg returned home. Additionally, the Rus had won trading concessions with the Roman Emperor, which boded well for the long-term economic prosperity of the Kievan realm. It is notable that the Rus ambassadors, who bore Scandinavian names such as Farolf, Hrolaf and Stemir, swore to uphold this agreement by swearing upon the Slavic gods, which suggests that Slavic and Norse customs had already begun to blend. Oleg died in 912, succeeded by Igor, the son of Rurik himself. The young prince was met with adversity at the very beginning of his reign. Troublesome Slavic Drevlians refused to pay him tribute. Igor, however, possessed the iron will of his Rurikid bloodline and was able to crush them in battle, imposing a harsher annual tribute upon them. Having proven himself, Igor kept the peace in his realm for a time. Like his predecessors before him, he began to dream about the Byzantines' wealth. In May of 941, Igor embarked on yet another campaign against the Byzantine Empire, as according to Russian historians, the Byzantines stopped paying the annual tribute agreed upon following the victorious raid of Oleg in 907, and because Igor wanted personal glory akin to that gained by Oleg. The Khazar sources also mention that the Kievan Rus were forced to attack the Byzantine Empire as a clause of their agreement following the Khazar victory over the Rus, but it is disputed. Sources differ on how big Igor's army and fleet were. Russian chronicles refer to the Byzantine sources of Theophanes Continuatus and mention a fantastic number of 10,000 ships. Since the ordinary ships used by the Rus could have 40 persons aboard, then the Kievan Rus army could have had 400,000 men, which is an absurdly high number for the age. The bishop Luitprand of Cremona, who visited Constantinople a few years after the Kievan Rus raid, wrote that the Rus had more than 1,000 ships during their raid, based on the words of witnesses. The Byzantine historian Leon Grammaticos writes about a 10,000-strong Rus army, which is more plausible given the previous Rus raids and the size of armies in the medieval period. A 10,000-strong army would fit in 250 Rus vessels, which is also a more plausible number. Igor's fleet moved from Kiev, and in 3 weeks it was on the shores of Bulgaria, where it was joined by the fleet of the Rus, which travelled from the eastern Crimea, or Tavrida as it was called by the Byzantines. Just like in the previous raids, the Kievan Rus chose a time when the Byzantine fleet was fighting Arab attacks against its Mediterranean islands. But this time, the Byzantine Empire was aware of the attack. According to Basil the Younger, the Byzantine vassals in Kherson in modern-day South Ukraine and Bulgarians, who enjoyed peaceful relations with Constantinople, informed them of an imminent Rus raid. On the 11th of June, the Rus reached the shores of Constantinople and set camp near the city. The sources do not mention any incidents of looting or pillaging the outskirts of the city, which happened during the previous raids. Some historians claim that it might be due to Igor hoping that the mere sight of his army might be enough for Emperor Romanus I to agree to his terms. But instead, Romanus I ordered the repair of the out-of-order dromons remaining in the harbour and to arm them with siphons, weapons spewing fire. The command of some 15 old dromons was given to the court chamberlain Theophanes. He ordered his fleet to move to the Golden Horn harbour and wait for the Rus fleet. Igor ordered the Kievan fleet to advance towards the Byzantine fleet, since the sight of 15 old ships did not cause any concern for him. Once the Rus fleet was close to the Pharos lighthouse, Theophanes ordered an attack. According to Luitprand, Igor ordered his men not to kill his foes and capture them alive, which might have been an attempt to use the Byzantine prisoners as bargaining chips. Theophanes' ship continued to advance towards the Rus, with his other ships coming close behind him. The Rus ships surrounded Theophanes, and it was then when he ordered the use of the Greek fire. Chaos ensued, numerous Rus ships caught fire, and Kievan warriors threw themselves out to save themselves, but their heavy armour drowned them. The rest of Theophanes' fleet joined the battle and further devastated Igor's fleet. While the majority of the Kievan fleet was destroyed, the Tavrik Rus fleet remained in the shallow waters on the shores of Anatolia, where large dromons could not move. Captured Rus soldiers were publicly beheaded. From then on, the remainder of the Rus army was divided into two independent parts. The Kievan army under Igor's command landed on the European side of the Bosphorus and destroyed the village called Stenon. But Igor did not have enough men to develop his advance and retreated to Crimea by July. The second part of the Rus army, the Tavrik Rus fleet, was pinned down by Theophanes' fleet in the shallow waters on the shore of Bithynia. In the summer, they landed and proceeded to loot, pillage and murder in retribution for the Greek fire attack. The empire did not have an army in the region and was hastily gathering one to defeat the Tavrik Rus. The Tavrik Rus were able to move as far as Nicomedia and Paphlagonia in the east, but were harassed by the units of Bardas Phocas until a larger Byzantine army under John Kirkus pushed the Rus to the shore, inflicting heavy damage. The sources are quiet regarding the strength of the army. By September, the Rus were running low on provisions, and in an act of desperation boarded their ships and tried to escape the fleet of Theophanes. But again the Greek fire was too much for the Tavrik Rus fleet, and the majority of it was destroyed. That would be the last Kievan Rus attack on Constantinople. Igor returned home and began mustering a far larger army than before, made up of the combined tribes of the Rus, and by 944 was ready to attack the imperial city. Hearing of the imminent arrival of this armada, Emperor Romanos I capitulated, giving up yet more precious gifts in tribute, while offering more concessions to Rus merchants. It should be noted that both Rus-Byzantine treaties are full of very specific trading stipulations, tariffs and customs laws. This emphasizes that the Rus princes were also merchants at heart. However, the princes Druzhina had long been dissatisfied with their pay and beseeched Igor to take more wealth from his subjects, saying, "Come with us, prince, to collect tribute, and you will gain and so will we." Igor agreed, and to that end rode to the land of his least favourite subjects, the ever-troublesome Drevlians. The Grand Prince had collected tribute from the Drevlians once that year already, and his return for more made evident that the Drevlians had had enough of Rurikid tyranny. They poured out of their city, killed the prince's retinue, and took him captive. Igor was then executed in a gruesome fashion. The Kievan prince's unceremonious death would lead to the rise of his widow, Princess Olga. Despite being around 25 years old, Olga had a Varangian spirit, was iron-willed and was cunning as a fox. Her revenge, recorded in the primary chronicle, has since become the stuff of legend. The Drevlians now had their own designs on the Kievan throne, emboldened by their murder of the Grand Prince. They sent envoys to Kiev with a proposal to Olga. "We slew your husband because he plundered us like a wolf. Our princes are good and have preserved the land of the Drevlians. So we come to you, requesting you to marry our prince Mal." The princess knew that marrying the Drevlian prince wasn't an option, firstly because he would surely murder her infant son Sviatoslav, and secondly because vengeance burned in her heart. Nevertheless, playing the role of the timid maiden, she feigned eagerness to accept the offer. The next day, she had the Drevlian emissaries carried to her palace in their boat under the guise of honouring them, only to have the boat thrown into a ditch and the emissaries buried alive. Olga followed up this ruthless deception with another. Sending a messenger to the Drevlians, she claimed she would happily marry their Prince Mal, if only they would send her an honour guard of their best soldiers so she could be escorted in a manner befitting a princess. A contingent of elite warriors were sent to Kiev, and once more, Olga welcomed them with feigned hospitality, allowing them the honour of using her own bathhouse. When the honour guard entered the sauna to wash, Olga had the doors barred and the building set aflame. Olga then travelled to Drevlian lands with a small retinue of loyal warriors. Upon arrival, she managed to convince the Drevlians that their emissaries and honour guard were on their way and were not in fact dead. A great feast was held in her honour. As the sun set and the crowd grew drunk with mead, Olga gave her cue and her warriors massacred over 5,000 Drevlians. Soon, Olga returned with a massive army to finish the job. Town after town in Drevlian lands fell until she reached their capital in Koristan. Knowing that cunning, not brute strength, was the key into the city, Olga offered an olive branch of mercy. "At this time you have neither honey nor furs, so I have a small request to make. Give me 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each household. I do not wish to lay a heavy tribute on you, as my husband did." The people of Koristan were overjoyed and eagerly fulfilled the princess's will. Unfortunately for them, the fires of Olga's vengeance had not dimmed. She had her soldiers attach to each bird a small piece of sulphur wrapped in cloth and tied to a fuse. When night fell, she ordered the fuses to be lit and the birds to be set free. Flying back over Koristan with their tail feathers alight, the sparrows and pigeons set the entire town aflame. Panicked and broken, the people of Koristan fled their city, only to be captured beyond the walls by Olga's soldiers, slaughtered, or enslaved. Princess Olga proved to be more than just a mass murderer. For many years after her annihilation of the Drevlians, she proved to be an effective, well-respected head of state, ruling the Kievan Rus as regent on behalf of her young son Sviatoslav. She proactively built settlements in the northern regions of her realm, while ending the ever-hated tribute system, replacing it with a better regulated system of taxation. An adept diplomat, she cultivated good relations with Kiev's trading partners, the most important of all being Eastern Rome. In the year 957, she set off for Constantinople on a diplomatic mission to treat with Emperor Constantine VII. There, she accepted the Christian Orthodox faith and was baptized. We don't know what Olga's motivation was, but it probably was done for political and economic gain. She made a piecemeal attempt to encourage Christianity in her realm, having churches built throughout it, but her subjects largely clung to their polytheistic faiths. Whatever gains Christianity made were further rolled back in 964, when Olga's regency ended and the young firebrand Prince Sviatoslav took the Kievan throne. In mannerism and dress, Sviatoslav resembled more his Slavic and Turkic subjects than his Scandinavian ancestors, the legacy of 100 years of Norse assimilation into the culture of their subjects. By all accounts, Sviatoslav's violent childhood had made him cold and ruthless. He rejected his mother's faith, believing that converting to Christianity would lose him the respect of the pagan warriors he rode with, and remained devout to the Slavic pantheon. Sviatoslav's reign would be defined by constant, unending conquests. While his mother continued to run the realm's bureaucratic matters, the young prince spent his days riding with his royal družina, raiding and pillaging neighboring nations. Sviatoslav and his warriors traveled without tents, wagons or kettles. They lived rough off the land, taking what they needed to survive by right of pillage or by hunting wild game. In popular legend, he was compared to a snow leopard, for he moved lightly and struck quickly. The young prince's first target of major conquest was the land of the Jewish Turkic lords. He and his warriors fanned out over the Eurasian steppe, town by town, tribe by tribe, forcing the peoples of Khazaria to submit themselves to the rule of the Rus or be annihilated. Sviatoslav employed Turkic mercenaries from other tribes, using their mastery of mounted combat to counter the equally skilled Khazar horse archers. In 965, Rus warriors stormed and annihilated the incredibly prosperous trading cities of Sarkal and Kerch. This was functionally the end of the Khazars, crippled beyond repair, and their empire would never recover. The final death blow came in 969, when their capital at Attila was destroyed. A year prior to this, Eastern Roman envoys had approached the Rus prince with an offer. In return for a hefty tribute of 15,000 pounds of gold, Sviatoslav was asked to participate in a joint invasion of the enemy of the Romans, the mighty Danubian Bulgars. Sensing an opportunity for wealth, war and glory, Sviatoslav eagerly accepted the Roman tribute and mustered a 60,000-strong army of Norsemen, Slavs and Pecheneg mercenaries. Like his ancestors, he struck like a lightning bolt from heaven, annihilating the armies of Bulgar Khan Boris II and quickly conquering the entirety of northern Bulgaria. Emperor John Tzimiskes now realized he'd made a deal with the devil. Sviatoslav was becoming far too powerful, and his marauding army would likely not stop in Bulgaria, but could pillage its way to the very gates of Constantinople itself. Knowing that Kiev was largely undefended, the Romans bribed the Pechenegs to betray Sviatoslav and lay siege to the city. The Pechenegs proved unscrupulous in the face of Roman gold, and promptly thundered into the Kievan heartland, laying siege to the Rurikid capital. Now an elderly woman, Olga was nonetheless able to lead her men and hold out against the Turkic horde until Sviatoslav could return with his army, driving the Pechenegs back to their steppe homeland. Olga died of illness soon after the siege, and was buried quietly on consecrated ground as Christian tradition demanded. In death, she was canonized as Saint Olga, with the epithet equal to the apostles. To this day, she is revered by the Orthodox Church. Meanwhile, the Romans, not content with poking the bear only once, demanded that all territory won by the Rus in Bulgaria had to be surrendered to the emperor in Constantinople, as Sviatoslav had invaded Bulgaria on their behalf. Sviatoslav refused and launched an invasion of Byzantium with a massive army of Norsemen, Slavs, Magyars, and contingents of loyal Pechenegs and Bulgars. The Rus coalition smashed against the gates of Adrianople, but were defeated by a Roman counteroffensive at the Battle of Arcadiopolis in 970. The Rurikid prince was forced to retreat to Dorostelon, where he held out against the Romans for 65 days, but cut off and surrounded, was eventually forced to make peace with them, relinquishing his conquests. Fearing that the truce with Sviatoslav would not endure, the Byzantine emperor induced the Pecheneg Khan Kurya to kill the Rus prince before he reached Kiev. Sure enough, while attempting to cross the cataphracts on the Isle of Kotitsa, he and his retinue were set upon by a hail of Turkic arrows. Sviatoslav was killed in the ambush, and according to legend, his skull was turned into a drinking vessel for the Pecheneg Khan. Upon Prince Sviatoslav's demise in 972, Rus was divided between his sons. The eldest, Yaropolk, ruled from the traditional capital of Kiev. The middle child, Oleg, ruled the rich land of the Drevlians, a tribe that had been thoroughly brought to heel by his grandmother, Olga. Finally, the youngest of the three ruled from the northern capital of Novgorod. The bastard son of a slave, he was overshadowed by his two half-brothers, and each of them were under the influence of the lesser lords, the boyars. For instance, Vladimir's domain was administered by his maternal uncle, the ambitious Dobrynya, while Yaropolk's realm was run by one of Sviatoslav's veterans, the Norse warlord Svenalda. With three puppeteered by ambitious men, the Kievan state was a powder keg just waiting to be lit. According to legend, that spark came sometime in 974, when the son of Svenalda, Lyut, wandered into the lands of the Drevlians on a hunting trip and was discovered by Oleg, who demanded to know who had the nerve to poach game from his forest. Lyut introduced himself as the son of Svenalda and was promptly executed by Oleg. We can assume this was done at the behest of his own scheming boyars. Back in Kiev, Svenalda was furious about the death of his son and put immense pressure upon Yaropolk to make war upon Oleg. The Norse regent was motivated both by vengeance and the prospect of controlling the rich Drevlian forest. Initially hesitant, Yaropolk was eventually cowed to Svenalda's will, and in 976 marched his armies into Drevlian territory. Oleg's forces were handily crushed by Svenalda. The prince fled with his army to the town of Ovruch, where in a frantic panic they trampled one another to get over the narrow drawbridge and behind the safety of the town walls. Yaropolk and Svenalda arrived a day later and demanded that Ovruch surrender Prince Oleg. Instead, the townsfolk pointed to their external moat. It was revealed that in the panic, Oleg, like many of his men, had been pushed off the drawbridge, where he had drowned in the muddy waters below. According to legend, Yaropolk ordered his brother's corpse to be dragged from the mire and laid atop a clean rug. Weeping heavily, he addressed Svenalda, "Rejoice now, your wish is fulfilled." In Novgorod, Prince Vladimir received the news of what had transpired. Advised that Yaropolk would likely attack him next, he fled to Norway to seek refuge with his relative, King Håkon Sigurdsson. Taking advantage of this flight, Yaropolk installed local boyars in Novgorod, effectively seizing control of the entire Kievan Rus. Vladimir, however, was not idle in his exile. Proving charismatic, the youth recruited an army of warriors in Norway and sailed back to Novgorod with his Vikings, kicking out Yaropolk's boyars and sending a message: "Vladimir is marching against you, prepare for war." Before his southward march, Vladimir wanted to secure an alliance with the powerful Rangvald, the Viking ruler of the Polotsk tribe, who lived in modern Belarus. The prince sought a marriage with Rangvald's daughter, Ragnhild, but was rebuked with disgust as the latter claimed that she would never marry the bastard son of a slave. This rejection infuriated Vladimir and his uncle Dobrynya, whose sister was the very slave in question. The prince gathered his Viking mercenaries and all of the Slavic tribes of the north, conquered Polotsk, slew Rangveld, and took Ranghild by right of conquest. Vladimir then commenced his southwards campaign upon Yaropolk. His army soon overran the tribes of the south, forcing the Prince of Kiev to flee to the town of Rozhnya, pursued doggedly by his vengeful younger brother. On June 11th of 978, Yaropolk gave up the fight, emerging from the city gates to make peace with his brother. Instead, he was cut down by Vladimir's Norse soldiers. The interregnum was over, and Vladimir now entered Kiev as the Grand Prince of Rus. Vladimir chose to commemorate his triumph over his older brother by reinforcing polytheism in his realm, uniting his followers by erecting not only Slavic, but also Norse, Finnic, and even Iranian gods on the hilltop above Kiev. Reportedly, the new Grand Prince was the archetypal heathen warlord. He feasted and feuded freely, while indulging in the company of 5 wives and over 800 concubines, many of whom he'd seized forcefully and enslaved. He was even known to engage in bloody rituals involving human sacrifice. Whether this portrait of a ruthless barbarian king is true, or the biased invention of later Christian chroniclers, we may never know. Like his father, Vladimir spent a good chunk of his early reign making war. In 981, his army seized much of Red Ruthenia, forming a borderland between the Rus and the powerful Piast kings of Poland. This would be the first conflict of significance between the Proto-Russians and their Western Slavic cousins, but as many are aware, far from the last. In the following years, Vladimir would suppress rebellions of his subject tribes, the Viatici and the Radomitians. He then turned his armies eastwards to the Volga Bulgars, defeating them in battle and making them subservient to him. Still somewhat under the influence of his uncle, Vladimir had grown into a ruler to be reckoned with. Yet throughout his early successes, the spectre of faith hung over him. We must now jump back in time and discuss the spread of monotheism in the east. The conversion of Olga in the 950s had been the Rus people's first real introduction to Christianity. However, the influence of the monotheistic faiths had been making gains in the states surrounding Rus for decades before that. The Latins and Greeks of the Frankish and Byzantine empires, along with the Muslims of the Persianized Abbasid Caliphate, were wealthy, powerful bearers of noble cultural legacies. As such, formerly animist and pagan peoples from Central Europe to the Eastern Steppe began converting to their monotheistic faiths to earn themselves a legitimate place in the political world of these economic and cultural heavyweights. The Khazars had been among the first to follow this trend. Before their destruction at the hands of Prince Sviatoslav, their ruling elite had adopted Judaism, the oldest of the Abrahamic faiths. Meanwhile, their neighbors, the Volga-Bulgar tribes, had converted to Islam in 922, seeking closer ties with their crucial trading partners in Abbasid Baghdad. Christianity had begun making headway in the 860s, when 2 missionary brothers, Cyril and Methodius, set out from their native Byzantium to spread the Orthodox Christian rite to the Slavic peoples. They travelled to the lands of Great Moravia, where they learned the local Western Slavic language and created for it a written script based on Greek letters, known as Glagolitic. Using their new alphabet as a cornerstone, they standardized many Western Slavic dialects into Old Church Slavonic, which became the new liturgical language. Now able to attend church services in a tongue familiar to them, the Western Slavs were Christianized. The Catholic rite eventually prevailed in Moravia, but Slavonic Christianity found success elsewhere. The Danubian Bulgars had converted to Greek Orthodox Christianity in 864, but didn't want to become too culturally dependent on their long-time Byzantine rivals. As a result, they welcomed the disciples of Cyril and Methodius into their lands, adopting the Slavonic church tongue over Byzantine Greek as the official language of their people. which is one of the reasons why arguably Turkic Bulgarians speak a Slavic tongue today. Furthermore, the Bulgars streamlined the unwieldy Gagalitic into something easier, the Cyrillic alphabet, named posthumously after Cyril. Prince Vladimir was slowly realizing that when his grandmother Olga had converted decades earlier, it had not been an admission of weakness, but an act of cunning. War brought glory to the Rus, but trade and commerce was the lifeblood of the realm. The princes of Kiev had maintained trade relations with their neighbours, but in order to deepen their ties with the wealthiest realms of Eurasia, they needed monotheism. Once more, it is Nestor's chronicle which tells us the legend of Vladimir's conversion. In 987, the Grand Prince had envoys sent to learn about Judaism, Islam, Latin Christianity, and Greek Christianity to choose which faith would be the best fit for his people. Vladimir was unimpressed by Judaism, pithily asking why a people exiled from their homeland could be a model to follow. Islam did not make a great impression either, as rather than venturing to the splendorous city of Baghdad, the Rus envoys learned about the faith from the Muslims of Volga Bulgaria, remarking, "There is no gladness among them, only sorrow and a great stench. Their religion is not a good one." Upon learning that Islam prohibited the consumption of alcohol, Vladimir remarked, "Drinking is the joy of the Rus. We cannot exist without that pleasure." Meanwhile, the Rus emissaries who had travelled to the western lands of the Franks proclaimed that their churches were unimpressive and their Latin rites were without beauty. Only in the Eastern Roman Empire did the envoys find joy. In Constantinople they bore witness to the full splendour of Orthodox ritual within the opulence of the Hagia Sophia. Upon their return, they said to their prince, "We no longer knew whether we were in heaven or on earth, nor such beauty, and we know not how to tell of it." Vladimir was sold upon the path of Byzantine Christianity, and the future of the Rus peoples was decided. Despite these colourful anecdotes, the real reason for Vladimir's choice was most likely a matter of pragmatism. Of the lands his envoys went to, Eastern Rome was the closest and richest, and furthermore, the expeditions of Igor and Oleg had already secured them a working, if rocky, relationship with the Greeks. Therefore, Vladimir stood to gain more politically and economically by choosing Eastern Orthodox Christianity over Islam, Judaism, or the Latin Rite. The Grand Prince was still a warrior at heart and wanted to convert on his own terms. To that end, he marched southwards with his army and took the Byzantine city of Chersonesus on the tip of the Crimea. From that position of power, he made a bold offer to Byzantine Emperor Basil II. "I have learned that you have an unmarried sister. If you will not give her to me, I shall do to Constantinople the very same as with Chersonesus." To the Eastern Romans, it was nigh unheard of for a Byzantine princess to be married off to some marauding northern barbarian. However, Basil was busy dealing with insurrection in his empire, fighting the rebellious general Bardas Phocas. He was in no position to open another front against the Rus. It was a decidedly better option to make an ally of them. Thus, the Roman Emperor agreed to give up his sister on two caveats. First, that Vladimir would send military aid to help him crush Phocas's rebellion, and second, that the Rus prince would convert to Orthodox Christianity, which he wanted to do anyway. In 988, the deal was struck. Vladimir was baptized in Chersonesus, renouncing his many consorts and marrying Princess Anna. He then went home, returning the town to the Greeks. True to his word, Vladimir sent a force of 6,000 Norse warriors across the Bosphorus, where they crushed Phocas's insurrection. So impressed were the Byzantines by these northern warriors that Varangian mercenaries would become the principal honor guard of the Eastern Roman emperors for centuries to come. Meanwhile, Vladimir's first order of business was to have his sons and boyars baptized, and he managed that with little difficulty. Next, he smashed the idols upon the hills above Kiev, which he himself had erected barely 10 years prior. On every street of the capital, town criers declared that by decree of the prince, Every man, woman and child was to come to the banks of the river, where they would all be christened in a mass baptism. Some went willingly, while some were coerced by threats of violence. Whatever the method, the people of Kiev were all baptized in the waters of the Dnieper. Originally distressed at being forced to marry a violent barbarian brute, Princess Anna came to see in herself a holy duty. Throughout her reign as Grand Princess, she served as the principal religious advisor for her husband and founded several churches. The Slavs called her Tsarina due to her imperial heritage, and she soon became beloved among them. Indeed, Christianity soon spread beyond the heartlands of Kiev and into every corner of the Rus realm. The Greeks loaned Vladimir many architects, who built Byzantine-style churches where shrines to Perun, Veles and Stribog once stood. Meanwhile, the Danubian Bulgars sent their clergymen north as well. The peoples of the Rus soon came to favour the liturgy of the Bulgarians, whose Old Church Slavonic was much more closely related to their Old East Slavic tongue than New Testament Greek. Along with Church Slavonic came the spread of the Cyrillic alphabet, which remains in use in Russia and beyond today. This mass conversion was not entirely peaceful, as many still clung to the old gods. In Novgorod, the elderly Dobrynya spread the Christian faith as per his nephew's will. However, he was attacked by a violent pagan mob which set fire to his home and killed his wife. In the end, the old regent forced the city to convert by fire and sword. Pockets of the Rus undoubtedly clung on to the old ways for a time, but by the end of Vladimir's reign, all major cities and centers of commerce became Christian by persuasion or force. The rest of Prince Vladimir's reign passed relatively uneventfully. For nearly 2 decades, the Rus maintained a stable peace with all their neighbors, the lone exception being the Turkic Pechenegs, whose horse archers semi-regularly raided Kievan lands. In response, Vladimir had a network of fortresses built upon the rivers bordering the eastern steppes to fend off their incursions. This would simply be the latest chapter of a long struggle between the Rus and the steppe peoples on their periphery. In his later years, Vladimir was said to be a kindly ruler. In accordance with Christian precepts, he provided charity to the poor and sick, and made efforts to travel to the more isolated areas in his realm, listening to the petitions of those who otherwise would never have gotten to meet him. He passed away from natural causes in 1015, leaving behind a massively different country to the one he had inherited 30 years earlier. No longer was the Rus a land of warlords and tribesmen. It was now a veritable Christian empire, competing toe-to-toe with the successors of Greeks and Romans in economic and cultural influence. The Grand Prince Vladimir had had many wives, and through them many sons, some more beloved than others. The most ambitious of these sons was Sviatopolk, the product of a forced union between Vladimir and a Greek nun. Sviatopolk had never felt his father's love, having been married off to the daughter of a Polish Duke Bolesław as a youth, and sent off to vegetate in backwater Turów. He had attempted to rebel against Vladimir as a young man, only to end up in prison. However, he was soon released, and upon hearing about his father's death, immediately beelined it to Kiev to claim the throne, which he did in late 1015. Sviatopolk soon found that he did not have the support of the Kievites, who preferred his half-brothers Boris and Gleb, who ruled the towns of Rostov and Murom respectively, and had always been the favourite children of Vladimir, likely to Sviatopolk's bubbling resentment. Boris had always been assumed to be the heir apparent of the Kievan Rus. Thus, when Sviatopolk took the capital, his boyars urged him to expel the usurper and take his rightful place on the Kievan throne. The Prince of Rostov declined, and replied benignly, "If any man say, 'I love God,' and hateth his brother, he is a liar. Be it not for me to raise my hand against him. Now that my father has passed away, let him take the place of my father in my heart." One would imagine that this would soothe the usurper's paranoia, but Sviatopolk sent his boyars and caught Boris, brutally stabbing him and all his servants to death. According to legend, Boris knew his murderers were coming but had sent his soldiers away, accepting his fate to prevent bloodshed. The executors then caught up with Prince Gleb on the river Smidden. It would be Gleb's own cook, bribed heavily, who would slit his throat. For these murders, Sviatopolk would earn himself the chilling epithet, the Accursed. Like his uncle Yaropolk before him, Sviatopolk had eliminated his brothers and seized control over the Kievan realm. But just like Yaropolk, he had not accounted for the old capital of Novgorod and the young prince who reigned there. Prince Yaroslav was one of the youngest children of the late Vladimir, probably born of Ragnhild, the Polotsk princess who Vladimir had taken at the beginning of his reign. The young prince spent his early years cultivating the skills needed to be a decisive leader, maintaining relations with his relatives in Scandinavia, whose sagas referred to him as Yaroslav the Lame, likely due to the permanent limp he had received from an arrow wound in his youth, an indication that he was experienced in battle. Indeed, Yaroslav wasn't afraid to assert himself. During the tail end of Vladimir's reign, he had refused to pay tribute, and a war between father and son was only subverted by Vladimir's death. Yaroslav was shrewd enough to realize that he too would soon be under threat. In a turn of events eerily similar to his father's rise to power 35 years earlier, the young Prince of Novgorod marched against his kinslaying brother with a force of northern Slavic levies and Viking mercenaries. Sviatopolk rallied his forces and hired a mercenary army of Pecheneg riders. The two armies met near Lubuk. Neither side dared to cross the Dnieper, and for weeks they stared at one another. At some point during the standoff, Sviatopolk's men began taunting Yaropolk for his disability, and calling his men carpenters, not warriors. "When we defeat you, we will make you build us a mansion." Deeply angered, Yaroslav's soldiers poured across the river and crushed the southerners in a vicious melee. Yaroslav then marched into Kiev, declaring himself the new Grand Prince of all the Rus, while Sviatopolk fled west. Sviatopolk had powerful allies in Poland, and his father-in-law was now the king. With Bolesław's support and German and Hungarian mercenaries, the accursed prince returned, seizing Kiev and forcing Yaroslav back to Novgorod. A brutal civil war would continue for another year, before Yaroslav finally defeated Sviatopolk in a battle at the Elta River in 1019. Sviatopolk died of illness while retreating back to Poland, and Yaroslav re-entered Kiev, declaring himself the Grand Prince. The Kievan Rus that Yaroslav had taken control of was a vastly different land to the one his father had inherited. Gone was the loose tributary confederacy of old, replaced by a centralized Christian empire. Yaroslav knew he could not rule his realm as a Rurikid warlord, so he set about becoming a just monarch, ruling upon the pillars of theology, learning, and law. The old ways of rugged pagan justice were no longer suited for a Christian ruler, so Yaroslav oversaw the composition of the first codex of Rus laws. The death penalty became rarer, and punishments became grounded in standardized fines, imprisonment, and confiscation. The legal groundwork laid by Yaroslav would become known as the Russkaya Pravda, the Russian justice, and served as the basis of Rus law for centuries. Yaroslav also promoted literacy among his boyars, educating their children to read, write, and appreciate the finer points of biblical scripture. He built schools around his realm, and allocated large funds for the copying of manuscripts, which was an extremely costly endeavor at the time. His reign saw the opening of the first Rus monasteries, while Kiev soon became one of the largest cities in Europe, a hub of international trade and higher learning, rivaling the powerhouses of Constantinople and Baghdad. Despite this, Yaroslav's reign was still defined by civil war and external conquests. In 1024, his half-brother, Prince Mstislav of Timitarachan, took advantage of his absence to launch an invasion. While Mstislav was unable to breach the walls of the capital, he managed to subjugate the hinterlands around it, moving his power base to Chernigov, a prosperous town right on Kiev's doorstep. The Grand Prince retaliated, assisted by Norsemen sent by King Anund Jakob of Sweden. He struck fiercely at Chernigov, but was decisively beaten by Mstislav's army. As a result, Yaroslav was forced to relinquish a good chunk of his realm left of the Dnieper to his half-brother. Thankfully, Yaroslav was soon able to turn his fortunes around by establishing a working relationship with Mstislav despite their recent conflict. Together they launched a campaign against the Poles in 1030, retaking the Cherven cities, which had been conquered by King Bolesław during his alliance with Sviatopolk. Yaroslav would later establish peace with King Casimir the Restorer by marrying off his sister Maria Dobraniega to the Polish monarch in 1043. Relations between the most powerful nations of Eastern and Western Slavs would remain stable for a time. Back in 1036, Mstislav had fallen sick while on a hunting trip and died. Taking advantage of his untimely demise, Yaroslav was able to reinstate control over the entirety of the Rus realm. Not that he had much time to rest on his laurels, as the Rus capital of Kiev stood as a monument of opulence, tempting any warlike peoples to try and seize its riches. In 1036, it would be the traditional frenemies of the Rus, the Pecheneg horde, that galloped out of their steppe lands to besiege the grand capital, just as they had a half-century earlier. Yaroslav was in Novgorod when he heard the news. One can only imagine the fury he must have felt. Enough was enough. The Pechenegs had been a thorn in the side of the Rus for too long. Yaroslav immediately rode south, forming an army made up of the men of Novgorod, Kiev, and a large contingent of Varangians, meeting the foe outside the walls of Kiev, where the two armies clashed. After a grueling struggle, the Turkic horde was crushed and routed. So decisive was this victory that from this point onward, the Pechenegs never again appeared as a significant player in Rus history. To commemorate his triumph, Prince Yaroslav commissioned the construction of the crown jewel of Kiev, St. Sophia's Cathedral. Yaroslav also undertook many outwards campaigns at the expense of the Lithuanians, Estonians, and Karelian Finns. At the end of his conquests, he had expanded the borders of the Kievan Rus significantly, turning it into a true empire. On top of his military triumphs, the Grand Prince had also expanded the diplomatic reach of the Kievan Rus further than ever before through a series of marriage pacts. On top of marrying his sister to the King of Poland, his son Vsevolod was married to Emperor Constantine IX's daughter Anastasia, and he bequeathed his three daughters respectively to Henry I of France, Andrew I of Hungary, and the famous adventurer king Harald Hardrada of Norway. These alliances enriched the Rus by deepening their trading ties to Western Europe, integrating the Kievan realm into the wider Christian world. However, as the Grand Prince grew old and weak, he began to fear for the future of his realm. The elderly Yaroslav had 7 sons, and he soon realized that upon his death they would fight an endless string of civil wars. In an attempt to prevent this, Yaroslav divided the Kievan Rus among his sons, giving each one a piece of his realm to rule autonomously. In practice, his eldest son Sviatoslav Yaroslavich was the heir apparent to the throne of the Grand Prince, but in practice he was equal in power to his brothers, the princes of Chernigov, Pereyaslav Novgorod, Volyn Smolensk, and Turov. Yaroslav begged his sons to get along and act in the common interest of the realm. In 1054 he passed away, and the golden age of the Kievan Rus came to an end. The first existential threat to Rus unity came in the form of thundering hooves from the steppe. Yaroslav had crushed the Pechenegs, but all this had accomplished was to leave their southern grasslands open for their fiercer, more numerous cousins. The Cumans were much like other Turkic peoples, excellent horse archers, bellicose to a fault. The Rus called them Polovsti, from the Slavic polya, field, although there are other etymological explanations. They called themselves Kipchaks, and the land they took over Deshti Kipchak. By 1061, the Cumans had entered the Ponto-Caspian steppe, and 7 years later they decisively crushed the Rus armies of Kiev, Chernigov and Pereyaslav at the Alta River. This allowed them to establish dominion over much of the southern grasslands, choking off the Rus' access to the upper Don, Volga and Dnieper rivers, crucial trade routes they had relied on for generations. After the battle, rebellions and civil wars erupted across the realm, and a popular uprising forced Sviatoslav to flee to Poland. A year later, he returned to Kiev with the help of the Polish army, but in 1078 he was finally killed in battle by his nephews. In theory, this shouldn't have crippled the realm. Turkic raiders and civil war were nothing new to the Rus. Vladimir and Yaroslav had dealt with both in their time, and preserved the integrity of their realm. This time, however, there would be no great prince to lead the Rus back to glory. Other external factors led to the political and economic stagnation of the Kievan realm. Back in 1054, the Christian world was divided by the Great Schism, when the Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople officially cut ties with the Catholic Pope in Rome, and as fellow Orthodox, the Rus sided with the Patriarch. As a result, the trading ties that Yaroslav had once cultivated with Western Europe declined. The Latin world came to see the Rus as heretics. Byzantium was not the powerful ally it once was either. In 1071, the Eastern Romans found themselves rocked to their core when a series of civil wars following a devastating invasion of Seljuk Turks saw them lose most of their territory. Between that and the Cumans cutting off the most prosperous river trade routes, the flow of wealth into Rus lands decreased significantly. Overall, Rus was becoming increasingly isolated. The branches of the Rurikid family became more numerous, and since Kiev was not nearly the hub of international trade it once was, these lesser princes began to identify themselves with regional interests rather than with the Rus state as a whole. As Kiev declined, the functionally autonomous principalities and republics of Vladimir Suzdal, Novgorod and Halych-Volhynia became the main powerhouses in the East Slavic world. This tide of fragmentation would be stymied by Vladimir Monomakh, the last truly great prince of the Kievan Rus. He managed to somewhat unite the increasingly disparate Rus princes back under Kievan primacy in 1095, and even managed to briefly turn the tide against the Cumans in a pair of victories against one of their most powerful Khans, Bonyak, in 1107 and 1114. Monomakh's reign would prove the exception to the rule, however. The reign of his son, Prince Mstislav Vladimirovich, would be a grim return to form, seeing constant wars with Cumans, Estonians, Lithuanians, and rebellious Rurikid princedoms. By the time of his death in 1132, people still paid lip service to Kiev, but the reality was that the unity of the Rus was dead. Despite all their troubles, their darkest days were yet to come. It is the spring of the year 1223, in a small wooded village of Zarub by the banks of the lower Dnieper. There, surrounded by his retainers, sits the haughty Mstislav III, Grand Prince of Kiev, a title that had long since ceased to have any real meaning. He looks upon a group of 10 envoys, hardy, irritable men, not unlike the other heathen nomads in appearance. They demand the swift extradition of Cumans that had fled into his lands. Mstislav scoffs. Who are these men to make demands of him, the Grand Prince of Kiev? If these Mongols wish to make trouble, then so be it. With a flick of his hand, his Druzhina steps forth and cuts down the envoys. The early stories of the Kievan Rus are almost always overshadowed by what came afterwards, the arrival of the Mongols. By the year 1223, the great horde of Chinggis Khan, a man who needs no introduction, had exploded across Central Asia, northern China, and Iran. Brilliant generals Subutai and Jebe made the Cumans the latest victims of the Mongol advance, forcing them to flee into the lands of the Rus. Ignoring the Mongol warning not to interfere in an affair that was not theirs, the Grand Prince made the fateful decision to side with his Cuman allies, arrogantly ordering the execution of the envoys, changing the course of Russian history forever. The Cumans under Khan Khoten and the Rus host, led by Prince of Kiev Mstislav, Prince of Chernigov Mstislav, Prince of Galicia Mstislav, and Prince of Volhynia Danilo, united their forces and marched against the Mongols. On the 15th of May 1223, they arrived on Khortytsia Island on the river Dnieper. Other sources find it tactically illogical to gather so many people on a small island, and argue that the actual rallying point was on the western bank of the river. The sources drastically differ on the number of men which the coalition forces had, ranging from 8,000 to 80,000. The Mongols knew about the whereabouts of the opposing force, and sent 3 envoys to deliver the message that the Mongols did not seek to fight the Rus, and were only after the Cumans, who had inflicted so much suffering on the Rus too. The Rus princes decided to kill the Mongol envoys, which was a grave violation of Mongol Yasa. Soon another group of Mongol envoys was sent, who just communicated to the Rus that now the sides would have to fight and it was not the Mongols' fault. Soon, the coalition forces became aware of the Mongol outposts on the eastern bank of the Dnieper. Young Prince Danilo rushed to view the Mongol horse archers, who he thought were poorly armed and equipped and were relatively small in numbers. Danilo informed the Council of Princes about this and urged to attack. The decision was made, and the Prince of Galicia Mstislav the Bold crossed the river to attack the Mongol outpost together with the Cuman forces. The surprise attack completely overwhelmed the Mongol forces on the spot. The majority were massacred, while a small group, together with the commander of the group, fled eastwards towards the main group of the Mongol army. The leader of this group was a commander named Gemya Beg, and his men tried to save him from being slain by hiding him in a Cuman kurgan. Historian Stephen Powell suggests that based on circumstantial and linguistic arguments that Gemya Beg was actually Jebe. The Cumans were able to find him and killed him afterwards. The Rus were able to capture some of the Mongol supplies, including cattle, while following them. At the time, the Rus princes did not have any centralized command, and the military decisions were made by a council. Despite the reservations of Prince Mstislav of Kiev, their decision was to pursue the fleeing Mongols. This pursuit went on for 8 or 9 days, with the Cumans together with the Galicians and Volhynians leading it, with the rest of the Galicians under the command of Mstislav the Bold behind them, followed by the army of Chernigov, and finally the Kievan troops, commanded by Mstislav Mstislavovich in the rear. Finally, the Mongol forces turned around and made a stand at the Kalka River. It is not known whether they were fleeing from numerically overwhelming forces, or it was a masterful bait to deceive the Rus-Cuman coalition into pursuing them to ground more favorable for the Mongols and creating an illusion of weakness of the Mongol army. It is also not entirely clear where the river Kalka is, but it is thought to be the river Kalmius, which flows into the Sea of Azov near the modern-day Ukrainian city of Mariupol. For a few days, the Council of Princes argued about the battle plan, but lacking central command, they failed to come to an agreement, and each prince would decide what to do, which would prove to be a serious blow for the Rus-Cuman coalition. The Mongol army consisted of 3 groups, with Subutai leading the center, Jebe heading the right flank, while Sugir Khan and Teshi Khan were on the left flank, together with Brodniki. Brodnik means either people of the ford or vagabonds in Russian, and probably refers to the warriors that joined Subutai during his campaign, possibly in the North Caucasus. The Mongol soldiers were all cavalry, with Brodniki and other auxiliary units, possibly infantry. Subutai's cavalry units had 500 men, with 5 rows of 100 riders in all of the units. The first two rows consisted of heavy cavalrymen armed with swords, consisted of light cavalry armed with bows. The Cuman army was made up of almost entirely light horse archers. The Rus army also employed horse archers due to its experience of steppe warfare, along with having heavily armoured cavalry akin to the Western European armies. The most elite troops would be separate bodyguard detachments. The Battle of Kalka River took place on the 31st of May 1223. At first, in the morning, the Rus Cuman emerged victorious against the vanguard of the Mongol army, which was significantly ahead of the bulk of the Mongol forces, after Mstislav the Bold and Danilo of Galicia and the Cumans under Khan Khotan crossed the river and attacked it, while the Chernigov forces were still crossing the river and the Kievan army camping on the western shore of the river. Khan Khotan continued the pursuit, forming the vanguard with Volhynian and Galician forces right behind them. Mongol heavy cavalry attacked the Cuman army and defeated them very quickly. After that, they attacked the Volhynians with a heavy barrage of bows, followed by a heavy cavalry attack. Prince Mstislav of Lutsk tried to help, but this was not enough as the Volhynians were also defeated. The Cumans and Volhynians had to flee the battlefield and ran towards the river, where Mstislav of Galicia was preparing his troops for battle at the time when the Chernigov army was still in the process of crossing the Kalka. The fleeing coalition troops were followed by Mongol cavalry archers. The panic of the fleeing soldiers who ran through the rest of the coalition troops caused panic in their midst. Mstislav of the Galicians tried to offer resistance, but since the battle formations were already disrupted, he was soon surrounded by the Mongol group having significant numerical advantage. Soon they started fleeing under the furious barrage of Mongol bows. Seeing the collapse of the Rus Cuman army, Mstislav of Kiev ordered his men inside the camp, which was hastily fortified with carts and other objects suitable for this. Sugir Khan and Teshi Khan were ordered to siege the Kievan camp, while the rest of the Mongol army pursued the fleeing Rus princes and inflicted heavy damage on them too. The Kievans were in a dire situation as the Mongols constantly shot bows at them, leading to heavy losses. They resisted until running out of drinking water, when the Grodniki leader Polskinia negotiated surrender with Mstislav of Kiev in exchange for ransom. The Kievans accepted, the siege was over, but the Mongols went against their promise, massacred many men while imprisoning the princes and later executing them during the Mongol feast as a reprisal for killing their envoys. The exact number of losses on each side is unclear, but sources tell of how only 1 out of 10 Rus men returned from the war. Afterwards, Subutai returned back east. However, now the Mongols had intimate information on the lands, politics and armies of the Slavs, and as such, the disunited principalities of the Rus were living on borrowed time. In 1227, the great Khan Chinggis died and was succeeded by his son Ögedei. Reinvigorated by new leadership, the Mongols spent the next few years finishing off the Khwarezmian and Jin empires. In 1235, Khan Ögedei convoked a Kurultai of his princes and generals and determined that their next theatre of expansion was in the lands of the Kuman Kipchaks, Volga Bulgars, and of course the Rus. The invasion force that was mustered was led by Subutai, the mastermind behind the victory at Kalka River 12 years earlier, and the up-and-coming Batu, the grandson of Chinggis. By their side were many other grandsons of Chinggis, including Guyuk and Monkör. The reason for such a star-studded invasion force was simple. As Khan Ögedei's brother Chagatai had warned, "There at the end of the world they are hard people. They are people who, when they become angry, would rather die by their own swords." The Mongols refused to underestimate the people of the West. In the autumn of 1236, a 100,000-man army was assembled in the Mongolian heartland, consisting of an ethnic Mongolian core and contingents from Uyghurs, Tanguts, Khitans and Jurchens. This force was composed predominantly of nomadic horsemen, but also included elements of Chinese siege engineers to bring the walled cities of Rus to heel. The great horde of Batu and Subutai set forth, and the traditional enemies of the Kievan Rus, the Volga Bulgars and the Cumans, with whom the Rurikid princes struggled for centuries, were put beneath the Mongol boot in less than a month. The Rus principalities were in a terrible position. As we covered in the last episode, they were notoriously disunited. Prince Mstislav III of Kiev had been influential enough to stitch together a coalition of princedoms to fight Subutai's initial expedition in 1223. But even this army had fought as separate units, loyal to their various princes, a drawback that had cost him the battle. Thus, when Batu entered Rus lands, he saw not a united people standing against him, but a row of dominoes ready to fall one by one. In December of 1237, the Mongol horde reached the city of Ryazan, which, although direly outnumbered, resolved to mount resistance against the invaders. It took only 5 days for the city walls to be breached by Chinese catapults. The slaughter that followed was recorded in the contemporary Chronicle of Novgorod, in prose that reflects the horror of the age. They likewise killed men, women and children, monks, nuns and priests, some by fire, some by the sword. They violated nuns and priests' wives, good women and girls in the presence of their mothers and sisters. It should be noted that Yuri Vsevolodovich, Grand Prince of the great city of Vladimir Suzdal, stood by and did nothing while Ryazan burned. While the ruling Prince of Ryazan was killed in the massacre, his brother, Roman Igorovich, managed to escape, fleeing with his druzhina along the Oka River, doggedly pursued by a contingent of the Mongol army led by Kulgen, the son of Chinggis. It was here that Prince Yuri of Vladimir finally intervened, deploying a contingent of troops to rescue the fleeing Rus noble. They made their stand at the town of Kolomna, where they were defeated and killed. However, in the fighting, Kulgen was struck down. His death would mark a watershed moment in the Mongol invasion. Some historians postulate that Grand Prince Yuri had planned to submit to the Great Khan, and his surrender might have inspired other princes to do the same, sparing them death and destruction. Now that option was off the table, as the death of a Chinggisid was something that couldn't go unpunished. During early 1238, the Mongols campaigned across much of the northern heartland of the Kievan Rus, committing numerous atrocities across multiple settlements, including the sacking of an irrelevant little town known as Moscow. The great city of Vladimir Suzdal was attacked in February, only to fall 3 days later. Yuri fled north, but was run down by a tumen of Mongol vassals at the Sit River in an engagement more akin to a slaughter than a pitched battle. With his death, so too died the hope of any united Russian resistance against the enemy. Realizing that, Batu Khan split his army up into contingents, ordering each to wreak havoc across the northern Rus. Over the next few months, 14 cities fell and were subsequently subjected to mass murder and destruction. There were a few key components to the Mongols' success. Firstly, the Eastern Slavs had avoided building their settlements on high ground for centuries, and the flat terrain surrounding their sedentary cities made them easy targets for Mongol siege weapons. Secondly, Chinese siege engineers used advanced catapults, which were extremely effective in bringing down the timber and earthwork walls of a typical Rus city. Thirdly, and most importantly, was the constant disunity of the Rus people. So entangled were they by their rivalries that they were happy to watch their neighbour destroyed by the Mongols, only to be surprised when they were struck next. To cope with this utter distraction, the Rus came to see the Mongols as not just another foe from the steppe, but as a supernatural punishment from God. Thusly said in the Chronicle of Novgorod, "God let the pagans on us for our sins. We always turn to evil, like swine ever wallowing in the filth of sin, and for this we receive every kind of punishment from God, and the invasion of armed men too, we accept at God's command as punishment for our sins. That is not to say that every living Slavic soul in northern Russia stopped resisting. One such example is the tale of the 12-year-old boy Prince Vasily of Chernigov, who against all the odds managed to hold out in his capital city of Kozelsk for nearly 2 months with only citizen militia, even managing to lead a successful sortie outside of their walls, where they slaughtered thousands of Mongol troops, destroyed siege equipment, and cut down the sons of 3 Mongol commanders. But they could not delay the inevitable. Kozelsk soon fell, and Vasily was slaughtered alongside every single one of his subjects. Nevertheless, the child prince's valiant defense left such an impact on the Mongols that they came to call Kozelsk the Evil City, and none dared mention it in their presence. Furthermore, Russian folk tales are full of defiant but ultimately doomed attempts to stymie the Mongol advance. One figure whose story emerged out of the Mongol campaign is Evpati Kolovrat, a Rus bogatyr whose story is the archetypal Rus tale of honorable vengeance. Evpati was visiting Chernigov when his hometown of Ryazan was put to the torch in the winter of 1237. Returning to see his home a charred husk and his people dead, he swore bloody revenge against Batu Khan. Scrounging up a small army of 1,700 survivors, he pursued the Khan, attacking the horde's rearguard and annihilating thousands of Mongol troops. In response, Batu Khan sent his relative, Kostovrul, to hunt this mysterious enemy. Evpati killed Kostovrul in single combat, and then began cutting down the dead general's entire retinue in a blood-drunk fury, before finally being slain from afar by siege weaponry. As the tale goes, Batu Khan showed a begrudging admiration for Evpati's bravery, and as a sign of respect, returned the warriors' bodies to his soldiers and allowed them to return to their homes. In truth, stories like that of Prince Vasily and Evpati are romanticized to varying degrees. Nevertheless, there is at least a kernel of reality in these tales of Russian resistance against Mongol domination. After all, Kievan Rus was a nation founded by warriors, so it is not unreasonable to believe that there were brave souls among the Eastern Slavs who were willing to make the Mongols bleed for every inch of land they took. In the autumn of 1238, Batu withdrew to rest his army, leaving behind the ruined northern Rus. The grasslands of southern Russia, Ukraine, and the fertile northern coasts along the Black and Caspian Seas remained untrampled for now. Along the Dnieper's banks stood Kiev, the cultural heart of the Eastern Slavic world, the mother of cities, an opulent memory of a golden age long past. After a brief rest, Batu Khan's campaign continued, thundering across the Pontic steppe. After subjugating the diverse peoples of the Crimea and campaigning against the Circassians in the Caucasus, they turned towards the Rus. In March of 1239, the city of Pereyaslav was put to the torch. Chernigov was next. Unlike many others, the men of this city rallied outside the walls to bravely face the Mongols in a pitched battle. Predictably, they were slaughtered. After this, the walls were breached, and the general citizenry were subjected to wholesale massacre. Thus, the gateway to Kiev was opened. The Mongols were fully aware of the cultural significance of Kiev and the power and prestige it had radiated for centuries. By this point, Kiev's prince, Mikhail of Chernigov, had fled to Hungary, leaving his voivoda, Dmitro, in charge of the defense. The Mongols had sent envoys demanding submission, but Dmitro had those envoys executed, and, of course, by now we all know what that meant. After a brief detour to subdue the Iranian Alani, the Mongols returned to Kiev in the winter of 1240, crossing the frozen Dnieper and laying siege to the city. The city's walls were quickly rendered into rubble by Chinese catapults, and the invaders poured into the city. Brutal hand-to-hand street fighting occurred, and Dmytro was eventually forced to fall back with his defenders to the Church of the Blessed Virgin, while the civilians took refuge in its walls. As scores of terrified Kievans climbed onto the church's upper balcony to shield themselves from Mongol arrows, their collective weight strained its infrastructure, causing the roof to collapse and crush countless souls under its weight. By December 6th, the struggle was over, and Kiev was in Mongol hands. In a rare act of clemency, Voivoda Dmytro was spared his life in recognition of his bravery, but the rest of his city was not so lucky. Of a total population of 50,000, all but 2,000 were massacred. The city itself was put to the torch. Of some 40 significant landmarks in Kiev, only 6 remained standing after the wrath of Batu. For centuries since the reign of Prince Yaroslav, the peoples of the Kievan Rus had been divided, but the idea of a common culture and a common empire remained. Now, with the mother of Rus cities a smouldering ruin, the nation founded by Rurik was dead. Kievan Rus was no more. After Batu Khan's campaign, the northern Rus lands were completely and utterly devastated, and while the south was not hit as hard, its major power centers, most notably Kiev, had been destroyed. Pockets of independent Eastern Slavic resistance would continue on for the better part of a decade, particularly in the westernmost region of Galicia-Volhynia, but by 1250, the entire former Kievan Rus was completely under Mongol domination. The socio-cultural impact that the Mongol invasion had on the Russian and Greater Eastern Slavic worlds cannot be understated. It would not be inaccurate to equate it to the fall of the Western Roman Empire to the Germanic tribes. Before the Mongols, the cities of the Kievan Rus had been a land of saints and scholars, the heirs of a once united empire rivaling other civilizations of Europe. Afterwards, it had all been reduced to smouldering rubble, a pale shadow of that glory that had once been, a conquered people living under the yoke of foreign warlords they considered to be the scourge of God. However, among all that wreckage and ruin, a certain settlement remained untouched by Mongol wrath. It was the oldest of the great Rus cities. We must rewind the clock a few centuries to contextualize the city of Novgorod's rise to prominence as an autonomous power in the pre-Mongol era. As you may recall from our previous episodes, Novgorod was the original capital of the Rus, founded by Rurik around 860. Even after Rurik's successor Oleg moved the capital to Kiev, Novgorod remained influential. The people of Novgorod had always been free-willed, so when the Kievan Rus began splintering in the early 12th century, the old northern capital emerged as one of the most dynamic independent powers. Novgorod ruled over a prosperous trading empire, with the city itself serving as a central hub of international commerce. This Novgorodian state had a unique system of government, as it was not a hereditary monarchy, but a republic since 1136, when the powerful merchant lords of Novgorod, backed by the general citizenry, overthrew Prince Vsevolod of Pskov. Legislative power in Novgorod was controlled by the Vircha, a form of public assembly consisting of nobles, clergy, merchants and commoners. Novgorod still had a prince, but he had to be elected by the council and could be fired if necessary. That is not to say that the Novgorodian princes became meaningless figureheads. In fact, a particular prince would soon emerge as one of medieval Rus's greatest military leaders, and to many, the savior of the Rus culture and faith. In the year 1220, a boy known as Alexander was born to the Vsevolodovich dynasty, who ruled Peroslavl, and later Vladimir. The young princeling likely spent his childhood years learning to fight and lead men. It was probably due to this pedigree that in 1236 his father dropped him off in Novgorod and the city council elected him to be their prince, beseeching the young noble to take charge of the city's military affairs. This was an incredibly tall order for a 16-year-old, as the city was in crisis. To the east, the unstoppable horde of Batu Khan was thundering across the Rus heartland, and it would only be a matter of time before the Mongols would come to Novgorod. In the west, the situation was just as volatile, as starting in the 12th century, various Latin Christian powers had made headways into northern Europe. The Vikings of Scandinavia abandoned their old gods by the mid-1100s and became more or less Christianized, which allowed them to expand under the pretext of Holy Crusade. The Kingdom of Sweden, in particular, began making ingresses into Finland, claiming it was converting the pagans of the region to Christianity, and by 1216, the Pope had recognized Swedish suzerainty over Finland. This expansion put Sweden on a collision course with Novgorod, who had economic and territorial interests in Karelia. The Catholic and Orthodox churches had finally begun to overlap in the north. Both sides desired land and power and considered the other to be heretics, so the potential for war was brewing. According to the Chronicle of Novgorod, in the summer of 1240, a Swedish army led by Bishop of Finland Thomas sailed up the Gulf of Finland in their longboats. They then proceeded into the Neva River with the aim of seizing control over Lake Ladoga, and from there, striking at the city of Novgorod itself. As the story goes, Prince Alexander wasted no time in rallying his Druzhina and confronting the Swedish host on the Neva, decisively routing the western invaders. It should be noted that the battle at the Neva is never described in Swedish sources, and this has led some scholars to question if the battle at the Neva even happened in the first place. However, most agree it was likely an impromptu border skirmish rather than a full-scale invasion. Whatever the case, the young Prince Alexander had won his first military victory at the age of 19 and received his first sobriquet, Nevsky. Alexander's success had made him some enemies as well, particularly the boyars and merchants of Novgorod, who believed that his war jeopardized the delicate trade relations in the region. Soon the political situation deteriorated to the point where Nevsky and his soldiers left the city. This was bad timing indeed, for the Swedes were not the only Catholics who had ambitions to take Novgorod territory. It is now we move our focus south to the dense forests of the Baltic Rim. Much like Finland and Karelia, this region was one of the last holdouts of paganism in Europe. The ancestors of the modern Lithuanians, Latvians and Estonians had been fighting a losing war against German and Danish invaders, who sought to convert them to Latin Christianity by force. By 1228, much of the Baltic shore had been subdued by German Catholics, except for the Estonian coast, which became Danish. This land became known as Terra Mariana, the land of the Virgin Mary. It was an unstable colonial frontier, divided into several bishoprics, directly sworn to the Pope in Rome, but still inhabited by Baltic peoples who continued to resist Catholic overlordship through guerrilla warfare. Throughout all this turmoil, a pair of knightly orders rose as the apex predators of the northeast. In Latvia and its environs, the Livonian Brothers of the Sword were dominant. At the same time, directly to their south, the Teutonic Order waged a bloody crusade against the pagans of Old Prussia, establishing control over the region. However, the balance of power was soon to shift. In 1236, with the backing of the papacy, the Brothers of the Sword launched an expedition across the Daugava River to subdue and convert the Lithuanians. However, Lithuanian tribes took advantage of the swampy forests of their homeland, ambushed the knights, and annihilated their invasion force. So crushing was this defeat to the Brothers of the Sword that their remaining members had to join the Teutonic Order. Now rebranded as the Livonian Order, they quickly rebuilt themselves into a powerful autonomous chapter of the Teutons, and this allowed them to wage a more effective war upon the indigenous pagans. By 1240, the Livonian Knights had established firm control on land as far east as Lake Peipus, and they now neighboured the Novgorod Republic. Once more, Catholic and Orthodox spheres of influence crashed together in northern Europe. The Council of Novgorod was initially divided on how to deal with the ever-encroaching crusaders. Initially, Slavic merchants prospered as trading partners with the Germans and Scandinavians, and intermarriage between the Rus and newcomer nobility was not uncommon. These ties to the west had been why Nevsky was forced into exile after his victory at the Neva. After all, what merchant would allow a glory-seeking prince to chase off their best customers? However, relations between West and East had begun to sour from 1224, when the Livonian Knights took Tartu, a city that Novgorod considered to be within its political orbit. The Crusaders also ramped up their efforts to convince the Novgorod aristocracy to convert to Latin Christianity, which irritated the Slavs, for whom their orthodoxy was the heart of their society. As diplomacy deteriorated, the German knights began to gaze greedily at the wealth of Novgorod, which, in their eyes, was a fair target as non-Catholics. Around the year 1240, Pope Gregory IX finally authorized a crusade against Novgorod, hoping that the Republic would be too preoccupied dealing with the Mongols to the east to defend. That same year, the Livonian Knights stormed the outpost of Koporye, conquering it with little resistance. They established a permanent garrison and began the construction of a stone castle, which made it evident to the people of Novgorod that the knights had come to conquer. Now in crisis mode, the Vichar of Novgorod turned back to the prince they had just exiled, begging him to return. Nevsky obliged, making haste for the northern capital. By the time he arrived, the Crusaders had taken Novgorod's sister city and breadbasket, Pskov. In the hands of an occupying force, it was a dagger pointed at the heart of the capital itself. Alexander knew that he had not a moment to waste, and in the autumn of 1241, he struck back, storming Koporye's brand new castle and capturing it swiftly. In the spring of 1242, he joined with the forces of his brother Andrei and thundered into Pskov, retaking the city with little effort, likely because the Teutonic Knights were preoccupied fighting the Mongols in Hungary at the time. Nevsky's swift military successes can likely be attributed to his Druzhina, the archetypal elite warrior retinue that had been a staple of Rus princes for centuries. Nevsky's force travelled light, taking towns and castles before their crusader enemy had a chance to respond, a manner of warfare akin to his pagan ancestor Sviatoslav the Snow Leopard 3 centuries prior. Following these successes, Nevsky mustered up a citizen militia to supplement his Druzhina's limited numbers, and launched an offensive raid into Catholic Estonia, breaking his army off into contingents to raid and pillage the countryside. This was a mistake, for he had overextended his forces, and the Teutons and their Estonian allies managed to ambush and destroy one of the Rus raiding parties in an ambush on a river crossing southwest of Tartu. Nevsky decided to cut his losses and orchestrated a careful retreat. Meanwhile, the Crusaders had been hastily assembling an army for a second invasion into Rus lands. Led by Bishop Herman of Dorpat, it consisted of a corps of knights alongside an allied contingent of Danish soldiers and native Baltic auxiliaries, mostly Estonians, and by spring they began pursuing Alexander Nevsky northwards. The latter found out about this and retreated to Lake Peipus, or Chud as it is called in Russian, waiting for the coalition forces to arrive at the battle scene. Here we need to make a disclaimer about significant differences in the sources about the battle in connection with such essential issues as the numbers, the place of the battle, battle formations, and whether ice played any key role in the battle at all. We know that the battle between Novgorod and the Livonian Order took place on the 5th of April 1242. However, historians still dispute whether it actually happened on the ice of Lake Peipus or not. We will describe the most popular and accepted account of the battle, which is especially propagated by mainstream Russian historiography. We will also describe the accounts of primary sources which dispute these claims. According to the generally accepted account of events in Russian historiography, Alexander Nevsky was able to lure the overconfident Livonian army, which also consisted of heavily armoured knights, onto the frozen surface of Lake Peipus. Based on the expedition conducted by G. Karivyev in 1958–66, it was determined that the battle took place near the modern Teplua Lake and the Raven Rock, which was the intersection of the old road to Pskov via ice and Novgorod on the 5th of April 1242. The first Novgorod chronicle also mentioned the Raven Rock as the place of the battle. Here is the first point of dispute. The Livonian Rimed Chronicle, which was written in the late 13th century, some 50 years after the battle, by a German author, can be considered as one of the primary sources for the description of the battle. According to it, many from both sides fell dead on the grass, and there's no mention of ice. Historian Igor Kleinenberg claims the grass to be a turn of phrase, while Kareviev argues that it refers to reeds in the shallow waters of the lake where the battle took place. The Laurentian Chronicle by the Orthodox monk Laurentius, written 130 years after the battle, states that the battle took place on the lake, but there is no mention of ice. The second point of dispute is the numbers the sides had. The problem is that the primary sources provide only numbers of the fallen, which we're going to discuss later, but nothing regarding the numbers at the start of the battle. Hence, even the Russian historians dispute the numbers. According to the Big Russian Encyclopedia, the Livonian Order and its allies had 7,000 cavalrymen, including 1,000 knights and numerous Estonian and Knecht infantrymen. Russian historians Sherbakov and Joyce claim a very small number, 700 to 750 for the Livonians and 1,700 to 2,000 for the Russians. A military historian, Razin, estimated 10 to 12,000 for the Livonian Order and 15 to 17,000 for the Novgorodian side. Strokov and Kapitchnikov propose around 30,000 to 35,000 combined men. Based on medieval warfare and battles in which the sides took part around the same time period, the British historian David Nicholl estimates that 2,600 men fought on the Livonian side and 5,000 on the Novgorodian side. The third point of contention is the battle formation and the course of the battle itself. According to the accepted Russian historiography, the Crusader army used a variation of the broad snout tactic. This tactic had the most experienced heavy armoured knights in the vanguard in an arrow formation, while the infantry, consisting of Estonians and Knechts, were behind them. The width of each row would be 10 to 12 cavalrymen or infantrymen. Each row had cavalrymen protecting the flanks. This tactic aimed to attack the very centre of the enemy with force and cause the disruption of the central ranks, eventually leading to a victory. Nevsky's army had a more traditional formation, with the army divided into the left flank, centre and right flanks with archers in the vanguard. The cavalry was placed on the flanks, while the Novgorodian militia was in the centre. The biggest difference is that cavalry was usually placed in the centre, but since Alexander Nevsky somehow knew about the Crusaders' tactic, he placed the cavalry on the flanks with the aim to later encircle the narrow formation of the Livonian Order. Nevsky himself waited in an ambush with a group of his elite bodyguard forces somewhere to the left flank of his army. The battle started with a barrage of arrows made by the Rus archers on the Livonian knights. The Livonian knights charged forward into the Rus centre. It managed to push back the centre, consisting of relatively inexperienced Novgorodian militia, but ultimately it was able to keep its formation and held its own for almost 2 hours when Nevsky ordered his left and right flanks to attack the Livonian flanks, while his group came out of ambush and attacked the Crusaders' rear. The Rus emerged victorious and chased the fleeing enemy for 8 kilometers throughout the frozen lake. Let us look at the primary sources again to see if their details corroborate what was described above. The Livonian Rimed Chronicle does not mention much in connection with the battle formation and the battle itself. It claims that the Novgorodians had many archers and had a 60-to-1 advantage. They attacked the Crusaders, who valiantly resisted, but in the end the numerical superiority of the Rus proved to be decisive, as they were able to surround the Livonians. The number is probably an exaggeration to whitewash the defeat suffered by the Crusaders. The Livonian Rymit Chronicle mentions that 20 brothers lay dead and 6 were captured. The Laurentian Chronicle does not provide much detail about the battle, merely implying the Rus victory and capture of many prisoners. It's the same with the Suzdal Chronicle, which mentions the victory of Alexander and the chase across the ice for 8 kilometers. The First Novgorod Chronicle mentions that the Germans and Chuds, Estonians, rode at the Rus, driving themselves like a wedge through their army, which might be a reference to the boar snout tactic. It also states that the Rus won victory and chased the Livonians for 8 kilometers until the Subol shore of Lake Peipus. In connection with the casualties, the chronicle states the following: "There fell a countless number of Chuds, and of the Germans 400. They captured 50 and brought to Novgorod." None of the primary sources state anything relating to Rus losses, and it is necessary to note that the information provided by the Livonian Rymit Chronicle and the Novgorod Chronicle regarding the Crusader losses do not necessarily contradict each other, as it is possible that the Livonian Rymit Chronicle provided the information only on the losses of Livonian knights, while the Novgorod Chronicle could have described all of the losses suffered by the whole enemy host, albeit with an exaggeration. The rest of the battle's details had been added later by Russian historians, as some claim that the details of the Battle of Wesenberg of 1268, which was also fought between Novgorod and the Livonian Order, were later incorporated into the description of the Battle on the Ice. This conflict, later immortalized as the Battle on the Ice, was a watershed moment in the relationship between medieval Rus and Catholic Europe. A permanent border between Novgorod and the Crusader states was established along Lake Peipus and the Narva River, and never again would the Teutons or their allies make serious ingress into Rus territories. For his victory, Alexander Nevsky earned immortality, known by all future generations of East Slavs as a saint who saved Orthodox Christianity. Now let us move back to the east and address the Chinggisid-shaped elephant in the room. While all this Crusader business had been happening, the Mongols had been ravaging their way through the northeastern Rus principalities. Nevsky's solution for the Mongol problem was simple: surrender. While other Rus cities mounted futile resistance against Batu Khan, Nevsky instead sent envoys, preemptively capitulating before the Mongols even reached his city, and accepting the Chinggisid Khans as his lawful overlords. Because Novgorod had surrendered so quickly and willingly, it was spared the destruction that other influential Rus cities were subjected to. Why was Nevsky so willing to capitulate to the Mongols, but so insistent on fighting the Crusaders tooth and nail? The answer was simple. To those who showed proper obedience, the Mongols ruled with a light touch. They had no interest in influencing their subjects' religion, culture, or prevailing system of government, so long as they paid tribute without issue, and allowed the Mongol Khans to confirm their leaders. Contrast this to the Crusaders, who had every intention of forcefully eradicating Orthodox Christianity, and one can begin to see why the Novgorodians preferred a steppe warlord to a German bishop. Nevsky spent the rest of his life as a loyal vassal of the Great Khan, making many trips to the Mongol capitals of Sarai and Karakorum to pay his respects. The ruler of Novgorod used his submission to the Mongols as a key to political advancement. Indeed, the Mongol Khan bestowed upon him the title of Grand Prince of Kiev in 1246. Of course, in the aftermath of the Mongol conquests, Kiev was a shell of its former self, but the title itself still held significant symbolic power and gave him an edge over other Rus princes who now competed for the Khan's favour. Alexander would only continue to grow more and more influential under the Mongols' wing. In 1252, his brother Andrei reigned as the Prince of Vladimir. However, when Khan Möngke ascended as ruler of the Mongol Empire, Andrei refused to travel to Karakorum to have his princeship confirmed. As a result, the Golden Horde launched a punitive expedition into Vladimir, chasing Andrei out of his lands and forcing him into exile in Sweden. In his place, Nevsky was confirmed as the Mongol-appointed Prince of Vladimir as a reward for his continued loyalty. Nevsky paid off the confidence the Mongols showed him in dividends, defending their authority whenever the need arose. In 1259, when the citizenry of Novgorod revolted and refused to pay tribute to the Khans, Nevsky marched into the city with soldiers, forcing his own people to obey their Mongol masters by force of arms. Nevsky died in 1263, taken by illness while journeying home from one of his trips to pay homage to the Khan in Sarai. The Rus he left behind was a complex one. On one hand, invaders from the west were defeated, their religion saved in the process. On the other, it had been utterly ravaged by the Mongols, becoming subjects of a foreign empire. The legacies of St. Olga, Vladimir the Great, and Yaroslav The Wise remained in the form of their faith, culture, and identity that they had helped build. But as the various Rus princes slowly reconsolidated their lands and power under the watchful eye of Mongol overlordship, it became clear that the age of the Kievan Rus was long behind them, and a new era had begun in what would become Russia. The new season in our series on the history of Russia is on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, commenting, and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.